Hello, welcome to Signal and Noise Podcast, brought to you by ROI Rocket. We're a Market Once company, that's our parent company. My name is Brian Lamar. Joining me as always, Andrew Basilos. Hello, sir, how are you?
Good morning, Brian. I'm wonderful. How are you?
I'm all right, you're looking great.
Thank you. Lots of numbers on my polo.
Yeah, right. Joining us today, one of my favorite guests. I don't know how many times he's been on podcast or webinar or how many times we've actually spoken, but Jeremy Zogby, he's the managing partner of John Zogby Strategies. How are you, sir?
I'm doing pretty well.
Yeah,
It's been a little while, but yeah, we've had the pleasure of talking a bunch of times over the years.
absolutely. And man, I swear we need to talk more often because I don't know, it's been a couple of years probably since we have actually recorded the podcast, but 2 years is like a lifetime these days with what's
Uh,
happening in the world. And we'll get into all of that. I listened to a few episodes of the Zogby Report, your fantastic podcast you and your father do and have done for a long time. And to me, I love it because I'm somewhat political. I know Andrew is too. And I try to get a read on where you all lie politically, and it's really hard to do. So you come at it with an unbiased perspective, and you do it with historical perspective, which is my favorite thing because I think understanding in context, and this is a very research point, understanding data and information in context is so important to what we do as market researchers and for you as a pollster. And you do a great job of that, and your father's done a great job of that. Your family and companies have done a great job of that. So, first off, fantastic podcast you guys have done for quite a while, and thanks for joining.
well, thank you. And I just want to say that I mean, my dad and I started it in early January of 2020,
Yeah,
and within 2 weeks, the story of COVID was breaking out. And I think on our fourth podcast, we talked about, what it was going to do to really change a lot of things. And so anyway, I mean, we started it in amidst revolution. And then, 2020, other than COVID, saw, no shortage of upheaval, social upheaval, political upheaval. And we've rebranded it to real polling in real time.
yeah,
Because we talked about polls before when it was the Zogby Report, real and unscripted, but we were literally going on recordings unscripted, and we would pepper in poll data where we had it. But this time we said, we're pollsters. Let's come into it with monthly polling and other polling and put that front and center. So
yeah, fantastic, great pivot. And one thing I should probably say is that we'll talk probably a lot about a few tough topics today. The world is a kind of a scary place right now, but I think we're going to do it from the lens of pollsters and from a behavioral standpoint. Like what is happening in America, and you have data that kind of tells us how people feel,
mhm.
sentiment in the U.S., and we kind of talk through that. And I'm kind of excited to do it because it's nice to take a step back from you know, I come home from work and turn on the TV, it can be kind of scary. It's nice to kind of take a step back and think about it from a researcher's lens or a pollster's lens or a data lens rather than, I think day to day we live, emotionally, right? We're human beings and things that happen affect us emotionally or affect our family or our community emotionally. Today, I'm hoping we can, at least I'm hoping I can, I'm sure you can, Jeremy, and I think you can too as well, Andrew, is to do it from a kind of an unbiased, almost academic lens.
Yeah, I'm game for that.
Yes, I kind of summarized the last couple podcasts and the last couple of weeks. It's just been, I think you could probably do this for any 2 week period in the last few years, but the past couple of weeks we had a Charlie Kirk the shooting in Memorial, and you've had dangerous rhetoric. I would say it's coming from both ends of the spectrum. Is it slowing down? And so you spoke a lot about that, the political climate and kind of the violence that's happened. And I want to talk about that. I really want to talk about independence and polling insights. We spoke for about 2 minutes before the call, and I think that's an interesting topic. And then we'll just kind of see where this takes us. Who knows where we'll end up with this thing? How's that sound to you guys?
That sounds good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Why don't we start with the political climate and violence? Start off negatively and we'll try to finish positively. Do you think that political events like that will affect short or long term voting habits on either side, or is it going to shift the direction of our country? And one thing I want to mention also is after the Charlie Kirk murder, there was a memorial where, and I'm not sure how I feel about this. The Republican Party basically shifted to a more evangelical stance. And I don't know if that's the party platform, but you had the upper leadership of the Republican Party really moving evangelical. And you could argue the merits of that. That's a whole discussion right there alone. But those are two kind of fascinating events. Is that going to affect voter behavior and party strategies moving forward? I'd love your opinion on that based upon data or just your personal opinion based upon experience.
Up front, I have to say I'm still trying to figure out
Yeah.
the totality of what the Charlie Kirk assassination will do in terms of voting patterns. For me, it's still too early to determine. But what I can tell you about that event, the moment I saw the headline about his death, and then quickly it was an assassin, and unfortunately, I saw the footage. I wish I didn't. I mean that. If I could go back in time, I wouldn't have done that.
Yep.
Now, that's important that I bring that up because, first and foremost, we're now entering, I think, potentially, very potentially, a phase where political violence seems to be an established trend. How many assassination attempts were there on Trump leading up to the election? There were 2 or 3. And then after the election, right, going into the spring, there was United Healthcare, the CEO, the cold-blooded, brutal murder. And then right before that, I know the Ukrainian refugee it's not like she was some influencer personality, well known, but that was a week before Charlie Cook. And where I started to connect the dots after Charlie Cook was in 1 week, we saw graphic violence freely available to the public.
Mm-hmm.
You notice how with the United Healthcare CEO, they showed Luigi Mangione like trailing the guy from behind.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm not aware of any clip that actually showed the gunshots, and if they did, that they appeared to edit it,
Mm-hmm.
all of that. But with the death of, and I forget her name, on the train in Charlotte, the Ukrainian refugee woman, and Charlie Cook, within minutes, those were widely available for millions of people to see. And so the graphic nature of the violence there for millions to see was something that immediately concerned me, as well as this trend of assassination attempts on Trump and then the CEO and then Charlie Kirk, all within less than of a year. I can't, as a pollster, help but notice, okay, is this something that becomes more commonplace? Because it does happen in other parts of the world.
Well, I'd love to add really quick also, there was a Minnesota state representative that was murdered
Yes.
earlier this year, and
Yes.
there have been numerous attacks on ICE facilities,
Yes.
including just yesterday. There was one as we're recording this. And so, yes, to your point, much more prevalent. So,
So
keep going.
so our political culture, and I've been talking about this for a while on the podcast. I've said Democrats and Republicans, of course, I think a lot of people recognize this, but I like to point it out that they're at war with each other. I go back to even before, but I thought another symbolic moment was, remember when Biden gave the speech towards the end of his presidency in Philadelphia, and he had a crimson red background, and there was just these really bizarre red, very deeply red, crimson red coloring, and he was talking, droning the term MAGA extremist, MAGA extremist, MAGA extremist. And look, I'm not political. I haven't identified with a party, I don't think, since my 20s. I'm now 42. When I see stuff like that, I think back to history, and I think of, the way an authoritarian leader is presented. And so in this country, it doesn't matter whether it's Democrat or Republican. Authoritarianism is the trend, and the weaponization of the other, the scapegoating the other, is going back and forth on both sides. And so we go back to your question about what that does for voting patterns. And my immediate question is, what about the middle, the moderates? And what about the independent, unaffiliated voters who don't go with either party. How do they fare in this election? And then further, I take it where I say Republicans have the advantage on the top issues.
Mhm.
Like they're rated as better among voters in general when it comes to people's perception that the Republican Party can handle better crime, they can handle better the economy and immigration, which are consistently the top three issues. Those are what, really matter to voters, and we've shown that over 2 years. But the Democrats are just not setting the, they're not setting the political scene on fire with putting somebody forward to carry the Democratic Party into the future. What we're starting to see is maybe a break off of like an urbanist socialist type party that,
Mhm.
like the Mamdani effect is what I'm calling it. I see him as a rising star, but I don't know how far he takes it beyond New York City. But and so I'm going to end here with this question and say that Republicans have the advantage on the issues, but I have a feeling they have the potential to turn independents off with, with the intensity, the mobilization for war is kind of like their rhetoric. And the Democrats, who are also doing the same, are not really drawing. And so one thing that I'm watching, I think is likely to happen in this moment is more voters potentially identifying as unaffiliated. We saw that in 2024 where they were 34% of the electorate.
Okay. That's huge. 34%.
Huge. Yeah. I mean, they outnumbered Democrats.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. That's according to the exit polls. And our polling leading up to it, we did a 50 state poll in June and we modeled basically that. We saw more independents turning out than Democrats and almost as much as Republicans. I don't think that's going away based on what I'm seeing.
Very interesting. What do you think then happens if we have what's currently kind of like a nebulous middle? What does it take for that to crystallize into like an actual third party? Does that ever happen? Or are we too far down the bipartisan rabbit hole for something like that to occur? Because as you mentioned, both sides are deploying further and further the rhetoric and kind of the doubling down on
Hmm.
like Brian, you said that like there's all this kind of like evangelical Christian rhetoric going around right now in the Republican Party, which is you can take that how you want depending on your own kind of personal faith life, spiritual life, things like that. But generally, like we have a separation of church and state. I think that is off-putting to some people and also incredibly mobilizing and energizing to others. So as you mentioned, Jeremy, like we're already really polarized and we're strengthening the magnet on each side of that. So at some point, does something happen in the middle? We have like the third party, there's some kind of organization.
Yeah.
Uh, or do we just continue to have more and more and more swing voters, independents, unaffiliated, who are truly kind of deciding the election based on the candidates at that particular time?
Yeah. I mean, that's a wonderful question. And again, it's a complicated one because when we talk about this hyperpolarization increasing, right? I hate to be offensive, but let's just say the crazies on both sides, right? The extremists on both sides. I'm just going to throw a number out there. Even if they represent only 10 or 12%, and I don't think it's that limited, I think it's more than that. It could be more than that. They are so loud that they can drown out the rest for those who are more centered by nature, moderate, or even in terms of, actual voting, unaffiliated. So in a sense, the middle can still get dragged into it, even if they don't take a side. The path can be paved by and when I say extremism, I more or less mean intensity. But I could see a scenario where we almost had I mean, if you look at 2024, there was a third party candidate who was pulling in immense support for a considerable time. RFK Jr. had as much as 20% of the vote when he declared that he was running as an independent. But if you followed that one, I mean, to get on the ballot in 50 states, it's so difficult. You have to be a billionaire. You have to be like Ross Perot. Ross Perot had no problem getting on, but and actually Ross Perot in the beginning of the 92 election was actually ahead in the polls. But what goes on there, unfortunately, I think we're such a bifurcated nation, the two party. I think two parties is so established in us and the rules are written against it that make it so difficult. You have to spend so much money. But when you look at it strategically, on the other hand, it also, if you want to sell it as an easy thing, you say, well, it just becomes a 34% strategy, where nationally in the polls, you just really need 34%. In some extreme cases, you could win two districts, one in Maine and one in Nebraska, that could throw the election into a contingency just by the way our electoral system works. And but still, it would have to come from somebody with hundreds of millions of dollars, if not, billions of dollars, who is just absolutely electrifying in their ability to communicate a better way. Is it possible? Yeah, I think it's possible after seeing how far RFK Jr. went. And I think he was immensely successful, even though his polling tanked at the end. He carried his voters to determine the election, right? Trump won essentially,
Mhm.
I'd say partly because of Kennedy voters went with Trump.
Mhm.
So, I mean, we do have that potential, but then we still have the issue, as I laid out earlier, that the intensity on the left and on the right is so powerful. And as you brought up with the evangelical, what I'm seeing is, yeah, I mean, people on the right who fall into that mindset believe that they're in a spiritual battle, but people on the left believe that a revolution is nigh on the
Mhm.
far left,
Mhm.
and that can be ugly. So I think if I had to say right now in the moment, I don't think a third party really does anything on just because the intensity is so baked in on both
Mhm.
sides.
Well, you saw some beginnings of that happen and a couple times. The Freedom Caucus, for example, and there's probably you could probably name up many others. It feels like to me, as a little bit of an outsider, you would know this more than me, that the system is rigged against the third party candidate as well. I feel like the two parties, and this is my perception, the two parties, while polarizing and they're all the things that we just spoke about, they work together sometimes for the best interests of those two parties to keep out a third party.
Yeah.
So, like funding, those parties get public funding during elections, and they, unless you poll a certain amount, you can't get public funding. You can't get on state ballots. I think RFK Jr. was only going to be on, well, I don't know how many states it was, but it was not all the states, and there was pressure to get him off the ballot on other states, and that would have happened if that was on any third party. The two parties will kind of collaborate to keep them out, and that might actually that's a challenge for a third party candidate. It could also be a benefit because I think these third party people, you mentioned it yourself, independents like corruption, ineffectiveness, and extremism for reasons for avoiding parties. This is just another example of potential corruption that you would feel that both parties are corrupt, and so maybe that is an advantage for a potential third party that, well, they're all corrupt. Let's all join this other one that is not corrupt. I don't know. I'm just kind of talking out loud, but certainly challenges that face a third party, and for independence.
Yeah. Yeah, and we're just talking about politics, right?
Yeah.
But there are other storms brewing. And you've got on the geopolitical front. I mean, I've studied history. I could tell you, so I'm only 42 years old, but I think you guys are about my age, more or less. But we've never been in our lifetime, we've never been in anything like this. This is the transition from I think at the 30,000 foot view, power is shifting east and away from the West. NATO countries are in debt up to their eyeballs. There's this hatred towards Russia, and we don't need to get into whether that's justified or not. I'm just observing it objectively. Europe and people in Washington, D.C. want war with Russia. China naturally sees itself as an ally, a Eurasian ally, and they're creating this BRICS plus system in which they're increasingly developing trade relationships, payment relationships outside of the DC NATO dominated system that since the end of World War II just dominated the globe. A lot of countries are just saying, look, hey, Russia had their assets seized, we could be next. So they're going and they're building their own system outside of the West, and a lot of that is creating tension, and looks to me like that's really the crux of what, as we hear more and more a global war, that's kind of like the behind the scenes of what's going on. So you've got that, and then you've got the economy. The economy is on shaky grounds in many parts of the world, and so you know this just really adds to the pressure cooker and makes it very complicated as to what happens politically. I think at the end of the day, voters will always just vote for what they think is going to keep them safe in their households and in their communities.
And it's, that's interesting to me that I'm a little older than you, in my 50s, and I remember reading about, I don't remember it happening, but I remember, I think it was Nixon went to China, and
Yep.
he was the first president kind of go to China. And China at the time was basically a third world country,
Yeah.
not a superpower, certainly not a geopolitical superpower, economic superpower, and now it is, and becoming very dominant in the world. And to your point, that's just, it's odd for those of us that are a little older that didn't think that would ever happen in our lifetimes, and it happened very, very, very quickly. And so that's something that's out there that I don't think a lot of people think about, is what China kind of chooses to do is very influential, especially when you put the BRIC countries together, like you mentioned. And it does look like they, in some areas, are kind of working together against, I don't know if it's against, but differently than the West, I guess.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I heard somebody sum it up as really, when you look at it at the 30,000-foot view, probably how somebody like Ray Dalio, and I like to listen to investors like that, because when you listen to their analysis, they cut through the ideological nonsense.
Hmm.
Because I'm not saying those guys are, perfect or anything, but these guys are managing billions of dollars
Mm-hmm.
and they don't want to lose it. And so they need to understand where's my assets and capital and the empire I built, where's that going to be safest? And that's how they analyze everything. And Ray Dalio would say, look at the West, it's a debt-based system,
Hmm.
and look at the East, it's a resource-based system. China and Russia have all of the rare earth minerals that we're going to need for these ever sophisticated growing chips, right? Russia certainly has the oil and the timber and the precious metals, and for whether we go down that path of solar and we go further down AI, you're going to need stuff, and not
Hmm.
just U.S. Treasury bills. And that's where the U.S. is in a tight spot. Is I think we're seeing the beginnings of a U.S. dominated world where the dollar reigns supreme, and our debt is as good as gold, or people are saying no, it's not. And
Hmm.
so that's going to have immense economic pressure on the United States. And whichever party can actually deal with that, can actually deal with the monetary issues that we're going to be facing, that's the party that's going to be ultimately, I think, more successful. And that's just kind of grounding it back in reality.
Yeah. You mentioned this is unique in our lifetimes. You are you're a history buff. You studied history. I ask you this question every time I speak to you. My guess is no. Is there anything historically we can look back on for similarities with what is happening in the U.S. right now with the war between two parties, as you stated, it seems to get more divided rather than getting closer. There does not seem to be a uniter. Has this happened before in history? Have you studied this?
In American history?
Not necessarily American history.
Okay. Well, I mean, I mean, I would look to for again, Mark Twain said it best: history doesn't repeat itself; it rhymes. So we're never gonna find the exact, but we'll find similarities. And I go back to the 20s in Weimar Republic, and that's not to say, some people will jump on that and say, oh yeah, Trump is Hitler. No, I'm not saying that. I'm saying that when you look at the 20s and how these paramilitary groups were running amok, you had the communists and you had the, the what would become the National Socialists, and all this chaos and hyper modernity, and a fundamentally conservative people that is Germans
Hmm.
going into the roaring 20s, and dealing with social culture wars. It's not pretty. It's tense. It's a lot of intensity, and it rips apart the social fabric. And so, I mean, but in the United States, we don't, I think there's a phenomenal book, that was written by Neil Howe, who wrote the Fourth Turning. And, even if you don't read the book, I would just watch Neil Howe's take on some videos about this cyclical thing. And we're in the fourth turning right now. What were other fourth turnings in the United States? The Revolutionary period, right? That was incredibly divided. That divided down to families. Families were split over whether they were going to be loyalists or whether they were going to be patriots. And then 4 generations later, we arrived at the Civil War. And that was, another one of those events that literally tore families apart. And then 4 generations later, we arrived at the Great Depression. Although there wasn't so much internal strife, there was World War II, which was the bloodiest war yet to date. 60 million people, in that global war. And then 4 generations later, here we are in the 2020s, and we're on the precipice of something big. It could be both externally and it could be internally. So this happens. This, and I love how Neil Howe summarizes it, where you go through 4 generations and you arrive back at the crisis. Interestingly, our generation, now, how old are you?
I'm 54.
How old are you, Andrew?
I'm 33.
Okay.
You're right in the middle of us. We've got a good representation here.
I'm surprised, Brian. I thought you were more in your 40s.
Everybody says that, but yeah, just
You look young.
don't have heart.
So
Thank you.
you're a
He's
Gen
so young
Xer.
at heart. He's so young at heart.
Yeah.
I'm a Gen Xer. We've yet to have a president. That's a whole. That should be my rant today, a political rant. Well, I think we're gonna skip Gen X as not having a president, and it was just kind of crazy to me. We're gonna skip the entire generation.
Well, Barack Obama almost was
Close.
Gen X. Yeah.
But with the millennials.
but and this is the point, that our generations are going to inherit. I see it as the system that came about for boomers worked very well for baby boomers,
Mhm.
and it ain't going to work well for us.
Mm-hmm.
And that is going to crack,
Mm-hmm.
and that's just going to crumble, and we're going to have to inherit that and deal with the rebuilding of that. And that's the lesson from history.
Yeah, you're welcome for the debt. Your economic instability. Yeah, I want to get back to independence really quick, and I'll let Andrew jump in because sometimes he dominates the conversation. Sometimes I do. This is kind of funny. We talked a lot about independence. That's not going away. From a pollster perspective, I'm assuming you have a long list of items you want to poll and study and try to understand before the next election cycle. Well, next year is what I'm considering the next election cycle. Can you talk more about that? What you plan on talking to independents about and understanding?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm in the process of figuring that out now, going into the midterms, because at the same time, you want to use the same metrics that you have, but as you enter into unique territory, you have to be prepared to ask new questions. So, we have been tracking independents' voting patterns, and this is kind of proprietary data, so I'm not going to get into how we break up independents into 6 unique voting patterns
Okay.
in terms of how they voted in elections.
I might need that for my next election, which is 27.
Yeah. Yeah.
What's an
Uh,
election? Keep going.
Do you have a lot of data for Columbia Township, Ohio?
I do. I do. I have over 4,000 voters, and I've got a few segments, but I haven't segmented independent voters, so I'll have to get back to you on that one, Jeremy. I'll hire you as a political consultant.
I was just going to say we could barter.
Oh, here we go.
Yeah.
There's historical relevance for that for sure. Yeah, we'll barter something. But anyway, I interrupted. You're talking
No,
about what
no.
you're doing with independent. Sorry.
No, that's fine. And so I mean, then, in the last poll we did, we said, all right, well, let's get beyond voting patterns. Let's ask how they've ever, have they ever been with either party? And I think you saw this data because we mentioned it in the second to last podcast. 44% of the independents, who currently we're modeling at about 27%, I think that's going to grow as we get closer to the midterms. Of that 27% who make up voters, independents, almost half of them say that they've never identified as a Democrat. They obviously they voted Democrat or Republican, and both, and somewhat, in between and varying levels. And even a cohort have just exclusively gone with minor parties, libertarians and Greens. But half of them have said, I've never been a Democrat or a Republican. And that told me a lot. That tells me that a candidate who can carry the strengths of both parties and drop the weaknesses of both parties
Mm-hmm.
can get attention. But, like we said, then you run into the bureaucratic hurdles
Mm-hmm.
in a national election. But obviously different at the state level, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I'll throw out one kind of last topic or brain teaser, or I don't know what you would call it. But it's fascinating to me. I studied political philosophy. I got into all of this because I did a political polling internship. That's how I ended up in market research
Wow.
from studying philosophy. It was not a natural jump. I always thought I was going to be an attorney. And I am an independent. I've at times been a card-carrying libertarian, but never actually been registered to Republicans or Democrats. So I kind of fall into this group that you're talking about. And as someone who is like 33 years old, you said two things that are very important to people in my cohort. One being that we will ultimately vote for what makes us and our families feel safe and stable. And the other one, you're discussing kind of like the economic conditions and a system that is breaking. And so I wonder, in your research, when you're obviously like polling the kind of like the rankings of the issues, that's something that's really, really important. What issues are most important to Americans when they're going to vote? It seems to me like, the gap between income and housing, the cost of debt, our abilities to ever retire, right? And I look down to my fiance has a half brother who's 10 years younger than we are. And like I'm replacing a lot of entry level jobs with AI. And then I look to, my children who are 5 and 7. I have no idea what their jobs will be or what the economy will look like or what in the world they're going to do for work. I have them playing with model rockets because I assume that we'll be going to Mars and there won't be any jobs on Earth. But so the serious and actual question that I have that has some meat on its bones and is not just ethereal is: do you see in the polling that you're doing unification across parties and perhaps among younger cohorts who will become the majority of voters over the next 5, 10, 15 years around these economic issues, particularly, like I said, housing and the future, being able to retire, things of that nature? And do you think that it makes a big enough difference? So this is thinking to like the independent voting patterns, that if someone could solve that, if someone ran on that, that create enough of a swing in the proverbial pendulum that kind of makes way for a third party? Does that unify us as a nation at all? Or is it just not? Because everyone, if they're Republican, if they're Democrat, if they're Libertarian, everyone my age who I talk to about that, oh my gosh, homes have doubled and my income went up 10%. What in the world am I going to do? That's a bipartisan feeling. So I just wonder, is that actually unifying when people go to vote? Does something like that matter?
Well, minus the third party part, that is basically what happened going into 2024. When Biden clearly was out, and by the way, I'm sorry, but it took a lot of people to see that. I saw that 2 years in advance. I just said, I don't see how this guy is gonna I don't see how he's gonna campaign in battleground states. He got away with it in COVID, right? Because of COVID, but there was no COVID in 2024. And so Biden was out, Harris was in, and there was an immediate emotional release because when Biden fell apart in the TV debate in late June, Democrats, you could feel it in the air, went to they fell into a low, an emotional low. And then Kamala was lifted up catapulted onto the scene, and they went into a high. And I saw in the polling, she was just running on an emotional high that Democrats said, okay, finally we got somebody, right? We're not gonna lose. But then as we got into October, reality was setting in, and it was less about the personalities of Harris and Trump. It was more about, okay, on November, what am I voting for? I'm voting for security in my pocket. I'm voting there with the perception across voters, whether you were independent or Republican, and even some Democrats were very concerned about the border. So they wanted security in their cities, and they were very concerned about what was going on at the border, and not necessarily just from a MAGA point of view. People started to realize the independents were very much concerned about immigration and the border. And that told me it wasn't a MAGA thing, that they were concerned about human trafficking and drug trafficking and the notion of a porous border. And so then voters got closer to election day and they said, we're voting for who's going to give us the least chaos. And we think Trump is better poised to deal with the economy, and we think he's better poised to deal with immigration. And that was heavily driven by young voters, those ages 25 to 34, which you're right in that category. They were very high on Trump, are coming out of the election and going into his first 100 days. And first-time voters, those who had never voted in national elections before. And Trump had that. He really had in a phenomenal not platform, but a phenomenal coalition. And then it just started to come undone as his approach to things, this age cohort 25 to 34, who were looking for security, were saying he's not giving me security. We just see a lot of chaos. So we started to see them drop off. So the next time around, it's going to have to be somebody who really means business and who can actually convincingly show that they know what to do about the housing affordability crisis. So yeah.
Well, I wish we could talk to you another hour. I know I could. Tell us about John Zogby's strategies. How can people reach you?
Oh, well, I mean, watch the podcast, listen to the podcast, real polling in real time with Zogby. And, you know, we didn't talk about this, but it's my dad and my dad is baby boomer, started the Zogby polling. I grew up in the business. He started it when I was 1. I mean, I was going to the office, not working when I was 6 years old, but I was frequently in the office as a kid, working by as early as a teen. And I've been
You're a telephone interviewer, right?
before that, I would go out into the field with a paper,
Yeah.
with a clipboard and paper and pencil.
I want to see
Seriously.
pictures of that. That's fascinating to me.
and so I grew up in this business. My dad started it, and we're obviously very different generations, but we're father and son. We have very different interpretations of current events and even sometimes history. but we do have commonalities where we come together. And I just think that's a dynamic that doesn't exist. And I think the whole backdrop is we're trying to demonstrate to people this is how we can talk to each other amidst these intense times. We don't have to, we see the human in the other and not necessarily the enemy in our neighbor and in our family members, because at the end of the day, it's ideas, it's not blood.
Yeah.
It's not humanity. And so anyway, people can watch this podcast. You can go on our website, johnzogbystrategies.com, and click the contact button to be put on our list to have it blasted to your email inbox. Or you could get in touch with either one of us on LinkedIn, John Zogby. I'm Jeremy Zogby. Or if you want to email me, jeremy@johnzogbystrategies.com.
Awesome. And by the way, you mentioned your father. I'm such a you know this. I'm such a huge fan of your father. He's the smartest, nicest. He's a legend in the industry, and
Thank you.
love. We could have had him on and had even a different discussion. It could have been even better. And one of my goals in life is to have a sit around and talk to you all at dinner. We need to make that happen sometime. Next time you guys are at a conference or out and about, when if I can barge my way in and just kind of sit around and talk about these issues, it's fun for me. And thank you so much for coming on. We'll talk to you again, hopefully before maybe the midterms.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Why don't we do
highly
it?
recommend the podcast as understanding independence and understanding current events from a market research pollster standpoint is really fascinating. So thank you so much for joining.
Thank you. And I just want to say real quick that I'll have far more insights because we're still in the eye of the storm of what we were talking about today. So I'll have even in a couple or a few months, I'll have even greater insight. So
Awesome. Looking
Can't
forward.
wait for that.
thank you. Thank
right.
you.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Take care.